July 25, 1944. Fritz Bayerlein couldn't hear anymore. The American bombers had seen to that. Standing in what used to be his command bunker, the general looked out at hell itself. His elite Panzer Lehr division, the best-trained armored unit in the German army, had been erased from existence in less than 3 hours. Not defeated, not pushed back. Erased. Bayerlein had fought across the continents. He'd served under Rommel in the burning deserts of North Africa. He'd seen his tanks crush British positions at Kasserine Pass. He understood war. He understood tactics. He understood how to beat the enemy. But this was something else entirely. For every German tank his crews destroyed, 5 more American Shermans appeared over the horizon. When his Panthers tried to reposition under cover of darkness, American fighter bombers would find them at dawn and turn them into burning coffins. His men whispered a new phrase in the smoking ruins, a phrase that captured the nightmare they were living through. Materialschlacht, the battle of material. And there was no chapter in any German field manual that explained how to survive it. ***, this is the story of 2 enemies, 2 armies, 2 completely different ways of war. Both wanted to destroy Nazi Germany. Both landed on the beaches of Normandy. Both pushed toward Berlin. But German commanders didn't fear them equally. One they respected. One they understood. One they believed they could beat. The other one terrified them. And the difference between these 2 forces would determine who won the war in the West, and how many Germans would die fighting it. By the summer of 1944, Wehrmacht commanders in France faced a brutal reality. The British were coming from the north. The Americans were breaking out in the south. Both had tanks. Both had artillery. Both had air superiority. Both wanted German blood. But they fought in completely different ways. And those differences meant everything. Let's talk about the British. First. German officers called the British approach the methodical sledgehammer. And once you understand how they fought, you'll see why that name fit perfectly. Every British attack followed the same pattern, the same rhythm, the same deadly choreography. First came the artillery, massive barrages that could last for 5, sometimes 6 hours. Thousands of shells raining down on German positions with devastating accuracy. Veterans who'd fought on the Eastern Front claimed they could sleep through a Russian artillery barrage. But British fire? That was different. It was precise. It was calculated. It was relentless. It didn't just destroy bunkers, it broke men's minds. German soldiers would emerge from these bombardments unable to hear, unable to think, their hands shaking so badly they couldn't load their own rifles. Then came the tanks. Hundreds of them, sometimes thousands, advancing in formation like a steel wall, grinding forward behind the curtain of exploding shells. Cromwells, Churchills, Shermans flying British flags, an armored avalanche that seemed unstoppable. And for the first few hours, it usually was. German forward positions would crumble. The British would advance 5 miles, maybe 10, occasionally 15 if the breakthrough was clean. But then, and this is the critical part, they would stop. Every single time. They would stop. The British would consolidate their gains, secure their flanks, bring up supplies, establish a new defensive line, prepare for the inevitable German counterattack. Hans von Luck, commanding elements of the 21st Panzer Division, noticed something remarkable about fighting the British. They would pause in the afternoon. His men joked that the British stopped to brew tea. It wasn't tea, it was doctrine. The British were professionals, they were careful, they were methodical, and they were absolutely unwilling to overextend their forces or expose their flanks. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had learned hard lessons in World War I. He'd seen what happened when armies pushed too far, too fast. He'd watched entire divisions get cut off and annihilated. So Montgomery fought the only way he knew how, cautiously, methodically, with overwhelming force applied at calculated points. And that predictability, that caution, German commanders learned to exploit it ruthlessly. The German response was called the backhand blow. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity. When the British attacked, don't commit your panzer reserves immediately. That's what they expect. That's what they're prepared for. Instead, let them advance. Let them punch themselves out against your forward defenses. Watch them gain ground while you hold your best units back, waiting, patient, like a coiled spring. Then when the British stop to consolidate, and they always stop, you strike, launch your counterattack while they're reorganizing. Hit their flanks before they can dig in. Exploit that pause, that predictability, that methodical nature that makes them so professional. It required nerves of steel. Watching your front line buckle while holding your best panzers in reserve felt like madness. But against the British, it worked. The British would gain ground. Then the German counterpunch would take most of it back. The front would stabilize. The cycle would repeat. Advance, counterattack, stabilize, repeat. And nowhere was this more clearly demonstrated than Operation Goodwood, July 18th, 1944. The British launched their largest armored offensive of the entire Normandy campaign, a massive assault southeast of Caen called Operation Goodwood. Montgomery threw everything at the Germans. 3 complete armored divisions, over 1,000 tanks. The flower of British armor, concentrated on a narrow front like a steel fist. The attack began with 2,000 heavy bombers turning the German forward positions into a moonscape. Entire villages disappeared. German soldiers were buried alive in their bunkers. The earth itself seemed to scream. It should have been the breakthrough, the killing blow. The tanks rolled forward through the smoke and dust. The shattered German first line evaporated under the weight of the assault. British commanders felt the momentum building. This was it. This was the breakthrough to Paris. Then the advance slowed. Then it stopped. The bombers had missed the second line, and the third. German anti-tank guns, positioned in depth, camouflaged, concealed, carefully sighted, began picking off British armor, 1 tank at a time. The dreaded 88mm guns opened fire from positions the Allied intelligence had never spotted. British tanks burned on the open ground, Cromwells brewing up, Shermans exploding. Fireflies targeted first, their long guns silenced before they could threaten the Tigers and Panthers. When the German panzers counterattacked, the British pulled back to consolidate. In 3 days of brutal fighting, they lost over 300 tanks. They Front line barely moved 5 miles. German commanders noted the result with grim satisfaction. The backhand blow had worked again. The British were dangerous, immensely dangerous, but they were predictable. You could plan for them. You could counter them. You could survive them. Then came the Americans. And everything changed. 1 week after Goodwood collapsed, the Americans launched Operation Cobra from the opposite end of the Normandy front. July 25, 1944, the day Fritz Bayerlein's world ended. Like the British, the Americans began with a massive aerial bombardment, carpet bombing that decimated Panzer lair and buried Bayerlein in his own command post. But what followed was nothing like a British attack. The American tanks didn't stop after breaking through. They kept going, and going. And going. George Patton's Third Army became operational on August 1st. Within 72 hours, American armor was racing across France at speeds that paralyzed German command. Patton didn't consolidate. He didn't secure his flanks. He didn't establish defensive lines. He told his tank commanders, bypass resistance. Keep moving. Let the infantry deal with anything we leave behind. German commanders positioned their panzer reserves for the backhand blow. They waited for the Americans to pause, to stop, to give them that critical window for counterattack. The pause never came. General Günther Blumentritt served as Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt after the war. He was asked which Allied general the Germans feared most. His answer was immediate: Patton. Blumentritt said that Patton fought more like a German Panzer general than any other Allied commander. He took risks. He exploited opportunities. He moved faster than the German decision-making process could respond to. Patton was chaos. Blumentritt said, his units appeared where our intelligence said they couldn't possibly be. His tanks showed up at crossroads before we even knew the Americans had broken through. The classical German counter-tactics assumed the enemy would pause. Patton's doctrine explicitly forbade pausing, and he wasn't the only nightmare the Germans faced. German soldiers had a name for American fighter bombers. They called them Jabos, short for Jagd bomber, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs. They owned the sky over France, circling constantly, watching every road, hunting anything that moved. It created a psychological condition among panzer crews that had no name, no treatment. Men developed permanent stiff necks from constantly scanning the sky. The distant drone of an aircraft engine didn't just mean danger, it meant the hunt was on, and you were the prey. German tank commanders learned that movement during daylight was a death sentence. The Jabos would spot the dust cloud from a panzer column and dive within minutes. Rockets, bombs, .50 caliber machine gun fire turning roads into burning graveyards. This destroyed the German ability to counterattack. The backhand blow required moving panzer reserves to strike the enemy's flanks. But moving meant dying. German tanks sat in concealed positions, camouflaged under trees and netting, waiting for darkness. By the time night fell and they could move, the Americans had already advanced another 20 miles. The British had air superiority, too. But American tactical air power was integrated with ground forces in ways the Germans had never experienced. American tank commanders could call in air strikes within minutes. Radio to fighter bomber to target. Target destroyed all in the time it took to smoke a cigarette. Asterisk, but even when German gunners did destroy American tanks, and they destroyed hundreds, it didn't seem to matter. German commanders noticed something deeply, profoundly demoralizing about fighting American armor. The tanks they destroyed kept coming back. A Panther knocked out in combat was usually a total loss. Germany lacked recovery vehicles. Spare parts were scarce. Once the front moved, any damaged tank left behind was gone forever, captured or destroyed by the enemy. American recovery crews operated differently. They moved onto battlefields while the shooting was still happening. They hooked cables to damaged Shermans and dragged them back to repair depots under fire. Tanks that took hits in the morning were patched up and back in action. By the next day, crews that survived a burning Sherman were given hot food, clean uniforms, and a new tank within hours. German commanders felt like they were fighting a Hydra from Greek mythology. Cut off one head, two more appeared in its place. Imagine being a Panzer crew. You've just destroyed 3 American Shermans. You're exhausted. Your hands are shaking. Your ears are ringing from the gun reports. You wipe the sweat from your eyes and scan the horizon for threats. And 10 minutes later, there they are again. 5 more Shermans rolling toward your position. Are they the same tanks you just destroyed? Different tanks? Does it even matter? They just keep coming. It stripped German commanders of the one thing they desperately needed to keep fighting: the belief that their victories mattered. Bayerlein saw this firsthand. His Panthers had killed American tanks. Dozens of them. It didn't matter. The Americans had more. They always had more. And unlike the British, they never stopped coming. In his interrogations after the war, Bayerlein described what Operation Cobra had done to Panzer Lehr. He didn't say his division was defeated. He said it was annihilated. The American bombing had turned his positions into a moonscape. Tanks were flipped upside down by blast waves. Crews died without ever seeing an enemy. Communication was severed. Supply lines were cut. Organization collapsed. Then the American armor came through, not in the careful British fashion, but in a flood that overwhelmed every defensive position. This was the true meaning of material schlacht, a fight where industrial output mattered more than tactical skill, where the weight of steel and explosives simply crushed everything in its path. German commanders were trained in maneuver warfare. They believed that superior tactics and crew training could overcome numerical disadvantage. Against the Americans, none of that mattered. By mid-August, the German position in Normandy had collapsed completely. American forces had swept around the German flank in a massive encircling movement. British and Canadian forces pushed from the north. The German 7th Army was trapped in a pocket near Falaise. The only escape was a narrow gap that Allied forces were racing to close. What happened in that pocket became a symbol of what American firepower could do to a trapped enemy. German columns trying to escape were caught on the roads. American aircraft strafed them continuously. Artillery pounded every avenue of retreat. Pilots flying overhead claimed they could smell the stench of death from hundreds of feet in the air. On the ground, it was an apocalypse. twisted steel, burning vehicles, swelling corpses. The smell so overwhelming that drivers had to cover their faces just to breathe. Between 10,000 and 15,000 German soldiers died in the Falaise pocket. Another 50,000 were captured. The equipment losses were catastrophic. Tanks, artillery, transport vehicles, everything the German army needed to continue fighting in the West. Some units escaped through the gap before it closed, but they emerged as shattered remnants, not fighting formations. The Wehrmacht in France had been broken. Hans von Luck survived the war. In his memoirs, he reflected on fighting both the British and the Americans. He respected the British, called them professionals, gentlemen soldiers. They fought hard, but they fought within limits that German commanders could understand and counter. The Americans were different. Von Luck found them less polished tactically, but their material abundance was overwhelming, and their willingness to take risks, to keep pushing even with exposed flanks, made them utterly unpredictable. In his book Panzer Battles, German staff officer Friedrich von Mellenthin compared the three major enemies directly. The British were cautious professionals. The Russians were an unpredictable mass. The Americans combined material superiority with an aggression that negated every German tactical advantage. German doctrine had answers for the British. It had no answers for what the Americans brought to the battlefield. German commanders learned to fear American armor not because of the tanks themselves. The Sherman wasn't superior to the Panther or Tiger in armor or firepower. They feared what American armor represented: endless replacements, constant air cover, logistics that could sustain advances across hundreds of miles, and commanders like Patton who refused to let tactical caution slow the advance. The British could be countered with patience and timing. The Americans could only be endured. By 1945, German commanders on the Western Front had stopped hoping to defeat American forces. They hoped only to delay them, trading space for time that Germany no longer had. The methodical sledgehammer could be survived. The swarm could not.